are going to be reviewed. There are essentially, I guess, two criticisms that even people who are in favor of human embryonic stem cell research have offered in the wake of the announcement of the final guidelines. One, as I mentioned, that there is going to have to be review of these hundreds of other lines. I actually think this review is not necessarily going to be as onerous as it might seem. People in California, people in Maryland, and in Wisconsin have looked at these lines over the years. Something is known about their provenance. They don't come as a complete surprise to the stem cell biology community. So it may not be as onerous, as difficult to go through these lines and decide if they comport with the spirit of the final guidelines as might appear. However, there are people who are still concerned that the new rules do block federal funding for the creation of research embryos. But I just remind you that the derivation process for embryos is pretty well known now, and this is something that can be done with other funds. It doesn't need to be done with federal funds from the United States. Then there are, of course, many who are still opposed to human embryonic stem cell research within the U.S. One criticism is that although other options have to be disclosed to people who may have supernumerary embryos to their progenitors, that nonetheless the particular fertility clinic may not disclose all of the options that may be available at other clinics. And then there's a concern that the NIH could decide that even its own requirements could be violated by some of the lines that derived before July 7, 2009 that it agrees to support in research. I actually think that will not happen, but I grant you that there may be some room for judgment about whether consent forms designed 10 years ago are as specific as the consent forms designed for this purpose in the last couple of years. The debate is not over. There are continuing deep philosophical disagreements about the moral status of the human embryo that have already been alluded to, and about whether government funds, public taxpayer dollars, should be used to do these things. I speak as somebody who was an advocate of changing the policy along the lines that President Obama has just done, but I think we have to admit and recognize and engage people who feel differently about these things. And I think that there are essentially three divides, not only in the United States but globally. First is the question, as I mentioned, of the research use of human embryos. Is it ethically acceptable to create human embryos so that they may be used for important medical purposes? There are around the world, particularly in Europe, there are some dates that seem to people to be arbitrary, much like the Bush administration's arbitrary dates. Do those dates have any moral significance, or are they merely political convenience? And finally, there's continuing disagreement about somatostatic nuclear transfer, not only because it creates something like an embryo that could be used for research, but also because, as Erica mentioned, is it leading us down some kind of a slippery slope? The harmonization problems are pretty severe, even though we think that the NIH has helped a great deal, and the President has. There are still great differences. I'll just mention Pennsylvania as an example. In Pennsylvania, there's a law that dates back to the early 1970s that concerns fetal tissue research. It defines a fetus as anything after conception. So it is the view, at least among the lawyers that I talk to in Pennsylvania, is that it is illegal in Pennsylvania to derive human embryonic stem cells in that state. But it is still apparently acceptable to import them. And so this importation position strikes many people as somewhat odd. Asia, relatively permissive for cultural reasons, historical reasons, religious reasons. It happens that, for example, that Jewish law, halakhic law, and Islamic law, Sharia, have a very similar view, a relatively permissive view about the early embryo, and that it may be used if it will benefit future medical patients, as long as it's treated with respect. In Africa and the Middle East, most countries have done nothing. Some countries have come forward and taken a position. Europe looks very much like the United States. It's kind of a patchwork. Germany, again, as far as I know, there may be some in the room and correct me, but my understanding is it's still the case in Germany that human embryonic stem cells may not be derived, but they may be imported. And my understanding is from the Israeli colleagues can correct me, that many of these ES cell lines that are used in stem cell biology in Germany are imported from Israel. So that's a little historic irony that I'd like to point out to my students. So as I said to you in the beginning, this topic is really, I think, a case study in larger issues. There are people who are very concerned about artificial reproductive technologies still, even though there could be 1 million babies who came from IVF since Steptoe and Edwards' work in the late 1970s. There are many people who are very concerned that ART is taking us in a direction in which traditional concepts of the family, male-female relations, parent-child relations are being challenged. How far can the life sciences go? How far can we permit them to go? Where are they taking us? What does it mean to talk about human dignity if we can manipulate the essence of what it is to be a human being in the form of genes and embryos and sperm? What about the commodification of our parts of our body that seems to be only increasing? So we just heard about this experiment in the UK in which you get a cut rate for your IVF cycle if you donate eggs. Well, does that reduce everybody to the price of their body parts? Even though you can get, I think at last ad I saw that a Penn undergraduate could get $40,000 for her eggs if she was a certain height and if she was a good athlete. I think at Yale it's $50,000. We're a little concerned about the Ivy League gap. And then finally, who gets included in the category of humanness? Many of the critics of this field are concerned that although we've gay people and people of color and people with severe disabilities are now increasingly, have in the last 50, 60, 70 years been brought within the ambit of what it is to be a human being, why not, they would say, why not human embryos? So these questions actually defy the standard political spectrum, the philosophical spectrum that we've inherited from the French Revolution, the left and the right. They actually cut across. So people who tend to be favorably disposed toward these kind of biological advances, not just stem cells, but biology more generally, modern biology more generally. There are innovation-oriented progressives like me. I think in general innovation is a good thing. I think it helps people. I think it helps us to nurture human beings and to make human life better. But there are market conservatives who basically just want government to keep its regulatory hands-off stuff that could create new value for business. And then there are social libertarians who just think that these are private questions and that government in general is too big and should stay out of our bedrooms and stay out of our gonads. But those who oppose, and so this is a spectrum from left and right in itself, but those who oppose these efforts in the new biology are Christian conservatives, people who take the Bible more or less, the New Testament, and in some respects the Old Testament more or less at face value. There are bioconservatives, people who are not necessarily specifically theologically grounded, but worry again that family relations, parent-child relations are at hazard here, that people are being reduced to the value of their body parts. And then there are people on the left, the people who are, you might say, Greens, who worry that the beneficiaries of this new science, and Jeremy alluded to the justice questions, the beneficiaries of this new science, who will they be? They will be people with money. They'll be people in the developed world. They'll be people who can afford the cool new stuff. But that this is part of a tendency in the 21st century, these people would say, to create a greater gap between the poor and the affluent, and that this will only aggravate those differences in societies. I want to talk for the last couple of minutes about two kinds of emerging issues that I think are kind of on the horizon. They haven't quite gotten there yet, but I think we're moving in this direction. I first want to talk about some of the implications of induced pluripotent stem cell technology. So one point to make: in Dr. Yamanaka's lab and Dr. Thompson's lab a couple of years that these viruses and human transfer therapies was applied to this